All right, let's go. Number 10. The Copper Knives of Lake Superior. In 2021, a team led by the geologist David Pompiani reassessed the radiocarbon evidence for copper tools from the western Great Lakes. The useful dates did not come from the metal itself. They came from organic material sealed inside its corrosion. Wood cordage fragments of the hafts these blades were bound to. 15 artifacts, dated that way, spanned roughly 8,500 years ago to 3,500 years ago. The oldest reliable piece is a copper projectile point from Wisconsin, 8,500 years old. That is older than the earliest smelted copper anywhere on Earth. Older than the wheel, older than writing, and older than the pyramids by nearly 4,000 years. And it was made by people with no pottery, no farms, and no towns. Mobile hunters and fishers. On the shores of the largest freshwater lake on Earth, by area, carrying metal blades through a landscape archaeology had quietly filed under Stone Age. The reason they could do it is geological. Along the Keweenaw Peninsula and around Isle Royale, copper occurs in the bedrock as native metal better than 95% pure. Glacial ice tore masses of it loose and dragged them south across Michigan and into Wisconsin. Nobody here had to invent smelting. They had to find the metal, and then they had to learn exactly what it would tolerate. What they learned is still visible under a microscope. Copper softens at around 400 degrees, far below the 1083 it needs to melt. So it can be softened in a fire over and over without any danger of it running. The blades were hammered, folded, hammered again, and annealed between cycles. Metallurgy done in the 1930s found annealing twins in the crystal structure, the signature of deliberate temperature control. The output is extraordinary. Knives from 4 centimeters to 30, socketed spear points, some drilled for rivets, awls, fish hooks, harpoons, crescents, pikes 3/4 of a meter long. At Oconto in Wisconsin, a cemetery of 45 burials gave up 26 copper objects. At Osceola above the Mississippi, an estimated 500 graves. On Isle Royale, the mining pits survive in the hundreds, protected now as a National Historic Landmark. The dating is still argued over. A reassessment published in 2022 by Michelle Beber and colleagues accepted early copper use, but put the unifying tradition after about 8,000 years ago. It also flagged an awkward gap. There are very few early dates from sites near the mines themselves. We know when the tools were used more confidently than we know who first went into the rock for them. But here is where the story turns, and it turns in the direction nobody expects. Around 5,500 years ago, the mining signal stops. The lead that working copper leaves in lake sediments fades out across the whole district, at roughly the moment the regional climate turns dry. Then, by 3,000 years ago, the working tools go as well. Copper does not disappear. It narrows to beads and bracelets and ornaments for the dead. Experimental work at Kent State put replica copper blades against stone ones and measured them. Stone starts sharper. Copper dulls more slowly. After the same amount of cutting, the two converge on the same edge. The metal was never clearly better. It was harder to find, slower to shape, and it bought almost nothing. So they stopped. Not because the knowledge was lost, and not because anything collapsed around them. The reasons put forward are demographic, social, and practical at once, and that is what makes the reversal so unsettling. The oldest metalworking tradition on the continent stopped being worth the effort, and the people who had practiced it longest kept their copper for the dead and went back to cutting with stone. Number 9. The Amesbury Archer. On the 3rd of May, 2002, archaeologists from Wessex Archaeology were clearing ground at Boscombe Down in Wiltshire, ahead of a school and a new road. 3 miles away, over the horizon, stands Stonehenge. In grave 1289, they found a man lying on his left side with roughly 100 objects packed around him, one of the richest burials of its period in Europe. 5 beaker pots, 2 stone wrist guards, 1 black and 1 red, a shale belt ring, 4 boar's tusks, an antler pin, a pendant cut from an oyster shell, a nodule of iron pyrite from a fire-making kit, 122 pieces of worked flint, including a set of barbed and tanged arrowheads, and 3 copper knives. The burial dates to between 2380 and 2290 BC. In Britain at that moment, there is no metal industry, no copper mines, no smelting, no casting, no metal workers. The island runs on flint and antler and bone. Those 3 blades are among the earliest metal objects found in the country, and the pair of small gold ornaments beside them is the oldest securely dated gold in Britain. What makes this burial extraordinary is that the metal is not the only thing that came from somewhere else. Carolyn Chenery and Jane Evans, working at the isotope laboratory of the British Geological Survey, measured oxygen and strontium in the enamel of his teeth. Enamel forms in childhood and then stops changing. It is a sealed record of the water a child drank and the ground it ran through. His enamel does not match Wessex. It records a childhood somewhere considerably colder, and the closest match runs to the Alpine region of Central Europe. Analysts at the British Museum then took the knives apart chemically. The copper is continental, and the trace element work points to sources in western France and northern Spain. None of the 3 is British, and none is Irish. All of it is imported. The blades and the man arrive together from opposite ends of a continent. Then there is the stone. Among the grave goods was a flat block of dark stone about 8 centimeters long, of the kind early smiths used to finish metal. A cushion stone. It is the tool of a man who knew what to do with copper, and it is why he is usually called Britain's earliest known metalworker, except he could barely walk. The Osteology by Jacqueline McKinley found his left kneecap gone destroyed by an injury years before his death. The joint damaged and infected afterwards. He lived with that for a long time. He also carried an abscess in his jaw that had eaten through the bone. So the picture assembles into something specific. A man in his late 30s or 40s, born within sight of the Alps, moving on a ruined knee across half of Europe into a country that had never seen. Worked metal, carrying 3 foreign blades and the tool for making more. Andrew Fitzpatrick, who published the excavation, does not think he was a full-time specialist. His reading is subtler and more disturbing. This was a man who symbolized control of a new technology, whose standing came from knowledge nobody around him had. 3 meters away lay a younger man, buried a generation later, who shared with him a rare inherited quirk in the bones of the foot. Ancient DNA has since shown they were not close relatives, and his teeth point to a childhood in southern England. A year later, a water pipe trench half a kilometer away exposed another grave. At least 5 adult men, a teenager, and 1 or 2 children, buried together with 7 cord-decorated beakers. Their strontium points to older, harder rocks somewhere west. They are all crowded into the same 2 or 3 generations, and they all end up on the same chalk. What survives of the first metalworking network in Britain is a piece of polished stone and 3 knives that were already old when they went into the ground. Number 8. The hoards of Pločnik. In southern Serbia, in the valley of the Toplica, there is a low mound of collapsed mud brick and burnt timber that people lived on for the better part of 1,000 years. It was cut through in the late 1920s when engineers drove a railway line past it and copper began to come out of the spoil. 4 separate hoards have now been recovered from Pločnik, around 35. Copper objects in total, about 16 kilograms of metal, 4 heavy hammer axes, 25 chisels, a pin, 4 bracelets. 3 of the hoards were buried close to an oven. In another trench, the excavators found a workshop 6 meters square, with furnace remains and the debris of casting on the floor. The settlement belongs to the Vinca culture and was occupied from roughly 5,200 to 4,400 BC. That is the problem. These are not ornaments. A 25-piece set of chisels is a working inventory, and a shaft-hole hammer axe weighing over a kilogram is a serious tool. To make one, the metal is cast around a core, so the hole is left behind. Then the casting is hammered and annealed to harden it. And the forging marks and deformed grain boundaries around those shaft holes show exactly that being done. This is not a first attempt. This is a craft that already knows its own limits, which raises an obvious question. Where did the metal come from? In 2010, Miljana Radivojevich and Tilo Rerin, with Ernst Pernicka Dusko, Sliver Michael Browns, and Dusan Boric, published an answer in the Journal of Archaeological Science. At Belovode, another Vinca settlement in eastern Serbia, they identified copper smelting slag in secure deposits, dating to around 5000 BC. Slag matters more than metal does. Native copper can be picked up off the ground, but slag is the waste of a chemical reaction. It means somebody had taken a green rock that contains no metal at all, held it above 1000 degrees in an atmosphere starved of oxygen, and pulled the copper out of the chemistry. Their paper extended the known record of extractive metallurgy by more than half a millennium. It also moved it geographically. The Standard Model had metallurgy invented once in the Near East and radiating outward. Belovode sits several hundred kilometers out of position and earlier than any smelting then known anywhere. And the author said plainly that their evidence revived the possibility of separate independent inventions. Later work by the same team tightened the earliest production evidence to the 49th century BCE, using 2 droplets of metal from a sealed refuse pit and a Bayesian model of the dates. But here is where the field gets uncomfortable, and it is worth being honest about it. When the same group later announced the world's oldest tin bronze, a scrap of foil from Pločnik dated to about 4650 BC, 2 of the original Belovode co-authors published a direct rebuttal in the journal Antiquity. Dusko Sliver had run the Pločnik excavation for years. He and Dusan Boric argued that the foil came from a spoil heap rather than a floor, with 3/4 of a meter of vertical uncertainty and no radiocarbon dates from that trench at all. The reply came in the same issue. The disagreement has never been settled. That dispute is about the tin. The copper is not in question, and what the copper describes is unsettling in a quiet way. There were no cities here, no kings, no writing, no temples, no standing armies. The most recent synthesis of the Balkan evidence argues that metallurgy in these villages was a communal craft rather than the private engine of an emerging elite. Ordinary farmers working ordinary furnaces ran the first extractive metal industry in the world. The process they were using has never gone out of service. Put an ore in a reducing atmosphere. Hold the heat. Take the metal out. Every bronze after this, every blade further down this list, every steel beam in every building around you runs on that same reaction. We do not know who worked it out. They left no writing and no name. Number 7. The Swords of Arslantepe. In November 2017, a doctoral student at Ca' Foscari University in Venice was walking through the museum of the Mechitarist Monastery on the island of San Lazzaro degli Armeni. Vittoria dell'Armelina studies the typology of early swords. In a display case of medieval material absent from the monastery's own Near Eastern catalog, she recognized a shape she had seen before. It was not medieval. It was 5,000 years old. Analysis with Ivana Angelini at the University of Padua identified the metal as arsenical copper, the alloy that dominated before tin bronze came into general use. The monastery's archives then produced the paperwork donated in the second half of the 19th century by an Armenian collector recovered near Trabzon on the Black Sea coast. The announcement came in February 2020. It is worth saying clearly that nobody dated this object physically. Its age rests on its alloy, and its shape matched a group of weapons found several hundred kilometers inland. Arslantepe is a mound outside Malatya in eastern Turkey. In the early 1980s, the Italian mission, then directed by Alba Palmieri, opened a room inside a monumental mud brick building and found a deposit of weapons lying on the floor. 9 swords, 12 spearheads, a quadruple spiral plate. The building belongs to a phase dated to roughly 3,350 to 3,000 BC in radiocarbon taken from the weapons room itself. Gives a range of 3,095 to 2,905 BC. The swords run from 46 centimeters to 62. They weigh between 410 grams and 960. 3 of the 9 have hilts inlaid with triangles of silver. They were cast in 2-part molds from copper alloyed with something like 3 to 6% arsenic, which hardens it. What makes this deposit different from every other pile of early metal is the shape of the objects in it. An axe is a tool. A knife is a tool. A spear is a hunting weapon that happens to work on people. A sword is none of those things. A sword is built for one thing, and that thing is fighting another human being at arm's length. It is a disturbing object to find this early. The building it came out of is not a farmhouse either. Arslantepe produced corridors, storerooms, and thousands of clay ceilings. The apparatus of an administration that counted what came in and controlled what went out. UNESCO, which inscribed the site in 2021, calls these the earliest swords known in the world and reads them as evidence for organized combat as the privilege of an elite. We have nothing earlier from anywhere. Weapons and bureaucracy arrive in the same rooms at the same moment, and the sword should not really work. Arsenical copper is soft. Stretch it out to 60 centimeters, and the result is a blade that will bend against a shield and hold the bend. These weapons sit at the absolute edge of what the metal of that era could physically do, which tells you something about how badly somebody wanted them to exist. In any practical contest, a shorter blade would have served better. These are not tools that happen to be beautiful. They are an argument cast in metal about who is allowed to kill. Around 3000 BC, the building burned. The end was brutal, and it was total. The fire was severe enough that the excavators describe it as the end of the whole political system that ran out of those rooms, and it brought the mud brick down onto the floors and sealed them. That is the only reason the deposit survived where it was set down. 9 swords stacked in a room in the last hours before the room stopped existing. The metal itself failed as an idea. Arsenical copper gave way to tin bronze tin. Bronze eventually gave way to iron, and every one of those transitions rewrote what a blade could be. The object did not fail. 9 of them lie in a museum in Malatya, and 1 turned up on a Venetian island in a case of medieval armor, unrecognized for a century and a half. Nothing like them appears again for well over 1,000 years. Then, the idea comes back, and it never leaves. Number 6. The axe the Iceman carried. At 3,200 meters on a ridge in the Ötztal Alps between Italy and Austria, there is a shallow rock gully that fills with ice. In September 1991, the ice had retreated far enough to expose a body lying face down in it. 2 hikers found him and assumed he was a modern climbing casualty. He was 5,300 years old, and because he had been frozen rather than buried, everything he had been carrying came out of the gully with him. A bow unfinished, a quiver holding 14 arrow shafts, a flint dagger in a woven grass sheath, a birch bark container with charred embers wrapped in leaves, 2 lumps of birch fungus threaded onto leather strips, a net, a hide coat grass insulation packed inside his shoes, and an axe. It is the only prehistoric copper axe known with its haft and binding still intact. Not the blade alone, which is all that ever normally survives, but the entire assembly. A trapezoidal copper blade seated into a knee-shaped haft of yew about 60 centimeters long, fixed with birch tar and lashed down with strips of hide. The wood of that haft has been radiocarbon dated to between 3,350 and 3000 BCE, which makes this one of the very few copper axes anywhere whose date is not an estimate. The blade is 99.7% copper. Trace arsenic, trace silver, essentially nothing else. For decades, one assumption sat under all of this, and it was a reasonable one. Copper ore occurs in the Alps. Alpine communities were mining and smelting it at exactly this date. Therefore, the axe was alpine, made from local rock by local people. And the interesting questions lay elsewhere. In 2017, a team led by Gilberto Arioli at the University of Padua tested that assumption directly by measuring lead isotopes in the metal. Every ore body carries a lead isotope ratio, fixed by its own age and its own uranium content, and that ratio passes through smelting unchanged. It is a fingerprint of the deposit, and it survives into the finished object. The fingerprint was not alpine. It matched the ore-rich hills of southern Tuscany around Campiglia Marittima and the Colline Metallifere, roughly 400 kilometers to the south on the far side of the mountains. A blade like this is cast and then hammered because an as-cast copper edge is soft, and hammering is what hardens it. Every step in that sequence happened in a real place. The isotopes fix the first step 400 kilometers from the body, and the result is unsettling for a reason that has nothing to do with distance. The paper's conclusion is stranger than a simple trade story, and it is worth stating carefully. Alpine copper sources were known. They were being exploited, and the metal in this axe came from Tuscany anyway. The authors described the mountain range as a clean, cultural barrier separating two entirely separate circuits of metal, and this single object crossed it. That rearranges what the European Copper Age looks like. Not a scatter of valleys, each discovering metal on its own, but circuits with edges and traffic that occasionally jumps between them. What they cannot tell us is what actually crossed. The isotopes identify the ore. They cannot say whether raw metal traveled north and was cast in an alpine valley, or whether a finished axe was carried over the passes into a region perfectly capable of making its own. That distinction matters because of what the man was doing when he died. There is an arrowhead lodged in his left shoulder, fired from below and behind. There is a deep cut across his right hand, days older from something he had already survived. He was above 3,000 meters, with an unfinished bow, and somebody else was up there with him, and whoever shot him left the axe. It was almost certainly the most valuable thing on his body, and it stayed beside him under the ice for 53 centuries, with its edge unbroken. There is something haunting in that. Whatever the killing was about, it was not about the metal. We can name the hills the copper came from to within a few kilometers. We cannot name a single reason it was there. Number 5. The steel 1,000 years too early. Kaman-Kalehöyük is a mound in central Anatolia, about 100 kilometers southeast of Ankara, 280 meters across and 16 meters high. Japanese archaeologists have been excavating it since 1986 under Sachihiro Omura, cutting down through Ottoman levels, Iron Age levels, Hittite levels, Assyrian trading, colony levels, and out into the Bronze Age. In the year 2000, in a layer dated to around 2100 to 1930 BC, they recovered a handful of corroded iron fragments. Reassembled, they appear to be parts of a single-edged dagger, roughly 5 centimeters long. In the same layer lay a small lump of slag and 2 iron-bearing rocks, or waste product, all 3 together in the late early Bronze Age. Hideo Akanuma of the Iwate Prefectural Museum, who has analyzed the site's metals for 2 decades, argued that iron was being processed on site. And in material excavated earlier from contexts around 1800 BC, he found what has been repeated ever since as the world's oldest steel. Iron carrying enough dissolved carbon to count as an alloy rather than an accident. It helps to know what early ironmaking actually is. Iron melts at over 1500 degrees, and no Bronze Age furnace reaches it. What a bloomery furnace does instead is reduce the ore without ever melting it. What comes out is a hot, spongy mass of iron with slag trapped inside it. That mass has to be beaten over and over to drive the waste out. Nothing about it is quick. Every step is harder than casting bronze, and the result starts out worse. Carbon, if any, dissolves into the iron during the burn is what makes it hard. That is the difference between iron and steel, and between a curiosity and a weapon. A 2023 re-examination by a team from Okayama University went back through 6 of the objects with modern instruments. The knife-shaped piece carries between 0.06 and 0.2% carbon. The early Bronze Age bar carries up to 0.6 to 0.8% in its interior, which is not a trace. That is a medium carbon steel. Across 205 separate point analyses, the nickel and cobalt readings sat almost entirely below the detection limit, with no Widmanstatten structure and no meteoritic mineral phases anywhere in the metal. Whatever this iron is, it did not fall out of the sky. It was pulled out of rock, except the same team declined to call it steelmaking. The carbon content varies erratically from object to object and shows no relationship to what each object was for. A knife is not carburized more than a pin. That is not a recipe. That is a furnace nobody could control, throwing out wildly different metal from one firing to the next, and somebody hammering out whatever the bloom happened to give them. It is a more disturbing picture than the headline, and a more human one. Nathaniel Erbsatulo's review of early Near Eastern iron carries the strongest objection on the table. The metal is badly corroded, which is exactly the condition in which chemical readings are least trustworthy. The shape of one supposed slag inclusion in the oldest piece is odd. Slag inclusions can come from smithing rather than smelting, which is not the same claim. And the earliest production debris on the site has already had its level reassigned once. None of that makes the iron go away. There is a documentary trail running alongside it. Merchants' tablets from the Assyrian colony at Kanesh in the same region and roughly contemporary record iron changing hands at up to 40 times the weight of silver. The entire quantity of iron in that vast commercial archive comes to something like 15 kilograms. It was the most expensive material in the ancient world. Nothing else came close. And people were buying it 6 centuries before anyone was supposed to be able to make it. 600 years later, a Hittite king was still writing to a foreign ruler to explain that good iron was not available in his storehouse, and that this was a bad time of year for producing it. Even at the far end of the Bronze Age, iron arrived in letters as an apology. What is missing from Kaman-Kalehöyük is the one thing that would settle the argument. We have the ore, the waste, and the product. 40 years of digging iron in the ground at every level and no furnace. Number 4. The axe with the iron edge. In 1972, at Gaocheng Taisi in Hebei province in northern China, excavators recovered a bronze axe of a type called a yue, about 11 centimeters long, ceremonial in weight, the kind of object carried rather than swung. It came out of a settlement of the Shang dynasty, roughly the 14th century BC. The cutting edge was not bronze. It was iron, and China has no ironworking industry for another 500 years. Li Zhong analyzed it and published in 1976. The blade contained significant nickel and cobalt. More importantly, the nickel was distributed in a banded layered pattern, the wreckage of a crystal structure called a Widmanstätten pattern, distorted by hot forging, but still legible. There were no smelting slag inclusions of any kind. That combination has one source and only one. Widmanstätten patterns form where molten iron and nickel cool so slowly that the rate is measured in degrees per million years. Slowly enough for two iron-nickel minerals to separate and grow into each other in long interlocking plates. Nothing on the surface of the Earth cools like that. It happens in the core of an asteroid insulated under tens of kilometers of rock, and it only reaches anybody because that asteroid was smashed apart and a fragment of its core fell. The edge of that axe came from space. 5 years later, at Lujiahe, on the outskirts of Beijing, a second bronze axe of the same type came out of a Shang tomb, smaller and undecorated. Analysis at the Beijing Institute of Iron and Steel Technology found the same thing. The meteoritic iron had been forged down to about 2 millimeters before the bronze was cast around it. That last detail is the whole story, and it is an extraordinary piece of problem solving. Iron and nickel from a meteorite melt at around 1500 degrees. Bronze pours at around 1000. So how is a metal that cannot be melted fastened to a metal that can, not by welding, which the temperatures rule out, not by cold hammering either, because iron of this composition cracks long before it is thin enough. There is exactly one route through. Heat the fragment to around 1000 degrees. Hammer it. Anneal it. Hammer it again until it is a thin blade. Then set that blade into the mold and pour molten bronze around it so the bronze grips it as it solidifies. Work published in 2018 by Chen Kunlong and colleagues confirmed the sequence from the microstructure. The bronze retains an undisturbed as-cast texture with no slip bands near the joint, which rules out mechanical fastening and leaves casting on as the only explanation. Radiographs of two related weapons in the Freer Gallery in Washington show something even more deliberate. The iron had been drilled through beforehand, and the bronze ran into the holes and locked. 3 evenly spaced spots buried in the join invisible for 3,000 years. Smelted iron does not appear in China for another 500 years conventionally at the end of the 9th century BC. 5 centuries. There is a contested exception, an iron bar from a tomb at Mogu in Gansu with radiocarbon dates in the 14th century BC. If those dates hold furnace iron and sky iron were in China at the same moment, the dating is disputed. The object is not. And then in the Guo State Cemetery at Sanmenxia in Henan, both kinds turn up in the same graveyard. 2 bimetallic blades from one tomb carry 12 and 14% nickel with cobalt to match, and their meteoritic mineral phases intact, so close that they almost certainly came from the same fallen rock. From another tomb opened in 1990 came an iron sword with a jade handle buried in a leather scabbard wrapped in silk. Its blade contains no nickel and no cobalt at all. It was smelted out of ore in a furnace on Earth. 1 cemetery. 2 blades from a meteorite and 1 from a fire. The smiths could not have told them apart. Chen's team point out that the pattern identifying the metal as extraterrestrial shows only on a cut and etched surface, at a scale they call hardly visible to the smiths themselves. They knew only that some iron came out of stones that fell, that it behaved unlike anything else they owned, and that it was worth wrapping in bronze. There is something haunting in that gap between what they were holding and what they could know about it. The supply never stopped. Iron meteorites are still arriving, and they are still the same family of iron-nickel alloys those smiths were hammering. Number 3. The dagger of Kaman-Kalehöyük. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk gave the order himself and paid for part of it out of his own budget. On the 22nd of August, 1935, Remzi Oguz Arik and Hamit Zubair Kose began digging a mound in north-central Turkey for the Turkish Historical Society. It was a new republic, and it wanted its own deep past described by its own archaeologists. What they found were 13 or 14 shaft graves roofed with wooden beams. The bodies contracted the goods extravagant. Bronze standards shaped like stags and bulls. Gold vessels. Gold jewelry. Silver electrum. These are usually attributed to the Hadeans and laid down in the 3rd millennium BC on dates that are still argued over, 1,000 years before the Hittite Empire that would later occupy the same hill. In grave K, there was a dagger. The hilt is worked gold. The blade is iron. Nothing about that should be possible. Around 2500 BC, nobody on Earth can make iron. The technology is more than a millennium away. Nobody can build a furnace hot enough or hold a reducing atmosphere long enough to pull iron out of ore. In 2008, a Japanese team led by Izumi Nakai measured the blade with a portable X-ray fluorescence unit without cutting it. Nickel oxide ran between 3.08 and 7.59%. And both nickel and cobalt rose and fell in step with the iron rather than with the corrosion, which makes them original components rather than contamination. The verdict was meteoritic iron. But here is where the whole picture changes, and it changes for every Bronze Age iron object ever excavated. In 2017, the geochemist Albert Jambon published a survey in the Journal of Archaeological Science, built on a simple, portable method. Nickel alone proves nothing, because weathering strips nickel out of buried metal unevenly. What does not lie is the relationship between iron cobalt and nickel taken together, measured at many points across one object, so that corrosion draws a line instead of a false answer. Meteoritic iron holds a cobalt to nickel ratio below 0.2. Smelted iron sits above 1 and usually above 10. He ran the method across the Bronze Age. The iron beads from Girza in Egypt, 9 of them excavated in 1911 and dated to around 3200 BC. A weathered pendant from a royal tomb at el Mara in Syria, the most corroded object in his sample. A ceremonial axe from Ugarit with an iron blade gripped between the jaws of 2 lions. Chinese axes. Egyptian daggers. The Kaman-Kalehöyük blade replotted from the published measurements. Every one of them meteoritic. In his own careful phrasing, most or all Bronze Age iron derives from meteorites up to a transition somewhere near 1200 BC. 2 independent teams reached the same verdict on the Girza beads in 2013. working on different beads with entirely different instruments. In one of those beads, only about 2% of the original metal is left. The rest is rust, and the answer still came out the same. The disturbing part is what all this removes rather than what it adds. There was no early iron industry, no lost technology, no forgotten furnace, no suppressed chapter of metallurgy waiting to be rediscovered. For roughly 2,000 years, every iron blade we have was a fragment of one particular rock that had fallen out of the sky in one particular place, found by somebody and beaten into shape by people with no way of making a second one. The supply was not a resource. It was a scatter of accidents. The method has critics, and they are not unreasonable. A 2019 paper argued that bloomery iron can take up nickel during forge welding, and that surface chemistry should never settle the question without metallography. None has ever been published on the Kaman-Kalehöyük blade. But nobody has produced a nickel-rich Bronze Age iron object that turns out to have been smelted. The low nickel scraps from Kaman-Kalehöyük remain the standing exception, which explains a pattern you can see in every museum that holds this material. These objects are in royal graves, and never in ordinary ones. The blade is set into a gold hilt. The Ugarit axe is held in the jaws of lions. Not because iron was better. It was not, and a good bronze blade of that century would have outperformed it, because there was no way to get more, and everybody involved knew it. Number 2. The Iron Mountain at Sevisik. In August 1818, two Royal Navy ships, the Isabella and the Alexander, were working the coast of northwest Greenland. When they met people the expedition had been told did not live that far north. John Ross called them the Arctic Highlanders. His interpreter was John Sachus, a Greenlandic Inuk who had reached Britain on a whaler. Ross traded for tools, and the tools were the problem. The assistant surgeon Alexander Fisher described the knives precisely. Small plates of iron set close together into a groove cut along a length of narwhal tusk. Not one blade. A row of them edge to edge, forming a cutting edge along the ivory. These were people with no furnaces and no smelting. Fisher concluded the iron was not salvage from a wreck. It was local. Ross was told the source lay a day's sledge journey away, at a place he wrote down as Sawalik, and he marked it on his chart as the Iron Mountain. The name he heard is Sevisik. Savik means knife, and it means iron, and they are the same word. 76 years and many failed expeditions later, the source turned out to be one of the largest iron meteorite falls ever found. 58 tons of it have been recovered across 8 separate masses. The Inuit had names for the 3 they worked. The tent weighing around 31 tons. The woman around 3. The dog around 400 kilograms. A fourth mass of 20 tons was found in 1963 by the Danish metallurgist Vagn Buchwald, who spent a career cataloging iron meteorites and the tools people made from them. The metal is roughly 8% nickel. At Arctic temperatures, it is also extremely hard, and there is no fire in that landscape that will soften it. So the working method was punishing, and it left a landscape behind. A stone knocks a fragment off the mass. The fragment is beaten flat, given an edge, and set into a slot in ivory or bone. The stones used for that work were basalt, and there is none nearby, so it was carried in from about 50 kilometers away. Researchers estimate something like 70 tons of shattered hammerstones around the blocks, with anvils among them weighing 40 kilograms each. The scale of the work is extraordinary and almost entirely anonymous. The woman and the dog were worn smooth on their working faces by the hammering. The archaeology puts the start of it around the middle of the 8th century AD, with a major expansion under the Thule Inuit from the 12th. We know how far the metal traveled because of the handles. Recent work measured the thickness of blade slots in bone and ivory hafts because the metal itself is usually gone, and traced the trade from the slots. Meteoritic iron from this one shore moved across Arctic Canada as far as Hudson Bay. An arrowhead of it turned up at a medieval Norse farm in southwest Greenland. A Danish survey of 74 iron objects from Greenland found a clean geography. In the far north, almost all of it is Cape York meteorite. Around Disco Bay, roughly half is natural iron, weathered out of basalt. In the south, all of it is European wrought iron. For most of 1,000 years, one rock supplied the cutting edge of the far north. Then Robert Peary arrived. Guided to the masses in 1894 by an Inuit hunter whose name he wrote down as Talakatea, he took the woman and the dog aboard ship in 1895. On the 12th of August, 1897, he loaded the tent onto the Hope using hydraulic jacks and a timber railway. Payment consisted of rifles, knives, ammunition, and biscuit. That was the price. In New York, the thing broke a 50-ton floating crane. In 1909, it was sold to the American Museum of Natural History for $40,000. On the same voyage, Peary brought 6 Inuit to New York at the request of the anthropologist Franz Boas, who had asked for one. Within months, 4 of them were dead, of tuberculosis among them, a man named Sevisik, whose young son, Minnick, was shown a staged burial by lantern light, while the museum kept his father's remains. The 4 were returned to Greenland and buried at Qaanaaq in 1993. The tent is still in Manhattan. It stands on steel posts that pass through the museum floor and down through the basement to bedrock, because nothing else in the building will hold it. Nearly 4,000 kilometers from the shore where it landed, Sevisik is still inhabited, and the descendants of the people Ross met still live along that coast without the rock that once supplied every blade they owned. Number 1. Tutankhamun's dagger. On the 11th of November, 1925, 3 years after opening the tomb, Howard Carter and the anatomist Douglas Derry began unwrapping the body of Tutankhamun. It took 9 days. Deep in the layers of linen, they found 2 daggers laid against the king's skin. One lay at the abdomen and had a blade of gold. The other was wrapped against the right thigh. That one had a blade of iron. It is 34 centimeters long. The hilt is gold, worked in cloisonné, and granulation finished with a pommel of rock crystal. The sheath is gold, carrying a lily pattern on one face and a feather pattern on the other, and it ends in the head of a jackal. And after more than 3,300 years, sealed in a dry tomb in a country whose soil and salt destroy iron, the blade has barely corroded at all. It looks almost new, and that is quietly unsettling. In 2016, a team led by Daniele Comelli of the Politecnico di Milano measured it in Cairo with a portable X-ray fluorescence unit. Nickel came in at 10.8%, cobalt at 0.58. Terrestrial iron does not carry nickel at that level. An iron meteorite does exactly that. They then went through the catalog of every iron meteorite recovered within 2,000 kilometers of the Red Sea. 20 finds. Exactly one, a fine octahedrite picked up near Marsa Matruh on the Mediterranean coast in the year 2000, sits within 10% of the dagger's composition. They were careful not to call it the source. It is the only rock we have that comes close. A second study in 2022, led by Takafumi Matsui, mapped the blade's chemistry across its whole surface. It found nickel arranged in bands about 1 millimeter wide, with a squared symmetry, and scattered sulfur-rich spots that look like the remains of a mineral called troilite. Both are things a meteorite has, and a forge destroys. For them to survive, the blade can never have been heated much above 950 degrees. Somebody shaped this object cool and slowly and did not ruin it. That is not luck. The same team found calcium in the gold of the hilt, consistent with lime plaster rather than the gypsum Egyptian workshops used, and suggested the dagger might not be Egyptian at all. It is a suggestion, not a finding, and the authors said so. Albert Jambon published a direct challenge in the same journal a few months later, arguing that a 1 millimeter pattern cannot be resolved by an instrument whose measuring spot is wider than 1 millimeter, and that calcium turns up on the blade too, where it looks like contamination. No reply has been printed. The disagreement runs deeper than that. 3 separate teams have now measured the nickel in this blade and produced 3 different answers, roughly 11%, 12, and 13. Each points to a different class of meteorite. They agree completely that the metal fell from the sky. They cannot agree which fall it came from. What makes the argument worth having is a clay tablet. Among the Amarna letters is an inventory of wedding gifts sent from Tushratta, king of Mitanni, to Amenhotep III, almost certainly Tutankhamun's grandfather. Item by item, the list runs through a dowry, and one line records a dagger with a blade of iron and a hilt of gold. The description does not match this dagger in its details. The pommel is a different stone, and there is lapis where this one has crystal. But it establishes something no amount of chemistry can. Iron-bladed daggers with gold hilts were moving between royal houses in the 14th century BC as diplomatic gifts, at the top of the most expensive gift economy in the world, and everybody involved understood what they were worth. Amenhotep died a generation before his grandson was buried. If this is that dagger, it was already an heirloom when the linen closed over it. 19 iron objects came out of that tomb. 16 small blades with wooden handles, a miniature headrest, an amulet shaped like an eye set into a bracelet. And this, out of roughly 40 iron objects known from the whole of Egypt from prehistory to the end of the 18th dynasty, 19 came from one room. The Egyptian phrase for iron bia and pet translates as iron of the sky. It becomes the standard word for the metal about a century after Tutankhamun is buried, which means the language that would prove his own people understood what the blade was does not arrive until he is already underground. The Iron Age is conventionally dated to after 1200 BC. Egypt does not smelt iron in any routine way for another 600 years after that. So the object lying against the thigh of an 18-year-old king in about 1330 BC belongs to no age at all. It is a piece of an asteroid core. It crystallized while the solar system was still assembling itself, drifted for 4.5 billion years, and came down. Somebody found it and understood that it was extraordinary. A smith shaped it below about 950 degrees because more heat would have wiped out the structure still inside it. And a workshop mounted it in gold, knowing there was no possibility of making a second one. We can measure the metal to a fraction of a percent. We cannot name the rock, we cannot name the smith, and we cannot say where it fell. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.